The emergency dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone line as Jeremiah Whitehawk collapsed on his kitchen floor, his weathered hand clutching his chest. "Sir, can you speak?" It wasn't Jerry who answered. It was the scratching at his front door, followed by the unmistakable sound of his cordless phone being dragged across the wooden floorboards. The dispatcher heard growling, then three distinct beeps as something, or someone, pressed 911 on the phone's emergency button. Through gasping breaths, Jerry whispered, She called for help." When paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, they found a sight that would haunt their memory forever. A massive bobcat crouched protectively over the unconscious man, amber eyes reflecting the porch light, while three smaller cats formed a defensive circle around them both. The lead paramedic later told reporters he'd never seen wild animals behave that way, like family protecting their own. As Jerry was loaded into the ambulance, barely conscious, he managed one final whisper. 8 years ago, I fed a starving kitten. Today, she saved my life. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Jeremiah "Jerry" Whitehawk had lived alone in these Appalachian mountains for 68 years, the last 3 without his beloved Martha. The weathered cabin that housed 4 generations of Whitehawks sat 15 miles from the nearest town of Millfield, West Virginia, surrounded by 50,000 acres of untouched forest that had been his sanctuary since childhood. Every morning at 5, Jerry would brew coffee in the same blue enamel pot Martha had used, speaking to her photograph on the mantel as if she might answer back. "Another day, honey. Wish you were here to see it." The silence that followed those words had become his constant companion. Since Martha's funeral 3 years ago, not a single soul had crossed his threshold. His only surviving relative was Thomas, the son he'd given up for adoption 45 years earlier when he was barely 18 and scared out of his mind. Sometimes Jerry wondered if that boy, now a man of 45 himself, ever thought about the father who let him go. At 68, Jerry's body carried the weight of 40 years underground in the coal mines. His hands, scarred from countless cave-ins and rescue attempts, now trembled when he tried to button his shirts. The heart condition that had forced his early retirement was getting worse, but at $300 a month for medication on a $1,200 Social Security check, Jerry had learned to ration his pills like a Depression-era housewife rationing sugar. The mountains that had once provided for his family were slowly being stripped away. Victoria Sterling's development company had been circling the area like vultures, buying up properties from families who could no longer afford the skyrocketing taxes. Jerry's own property taxes had jumped from $1,200 to $8,000 in just 2 years, a burden that kept him awake most nights, calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up right. "Tough as nails outside, soft as butter inside," Martha used to say about him, usually after catching him feeding stray cats or nursing an injured bird back to health. She'd been right about the soft part. Jerry had always been drawn to broken things. Broken men in the mines, broken animals in the woods, broken dreams that just needed someone to believe in them again. His daily routine had become a ritual of survival. Coffee with Martha's ghost, breakfast at Murphy's Diner when he could afford the $4.50 special, and evenings on the porch, listening to the sounds of a forest that was slowly disappearing to progress. The loneliness sat in his chest like a physical weight, heavier some days than others, but always there. Most folks in Millfield thought old Jerry had given up on living after Martha died. They'd see him shuffling through town, talking to himself, and shake their heads with pity. What they didn't know was that Jerry Whitehawk was about to stumble into the greatest purpose of his life, hidden behind a dumpster on a rainy spring morning, in the form of the most unlikely family he'd ever imagined. 8 years ago, Jerry had finished his usual breakfast at Murphy's Diner. 2 eggs over easy, hash browns, and black coffee that could strip paint off a barn door. The spring rain drummed against the windows as he counted out exact change from his worn leather wallet, leaving his customary 50-cent tip despite his tight budget. Old habits died hard, and Martha had raised him to always tip the waitresses who worked harder than most folks realized. As he pushed through the diner's back door into the alley, a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. It wasn't the usual racket of cats fighting over scraps or the rumble of garbage trucks. This was different. A high-pitched, desperate crying that seemed to come from somewhere deep in a creature's soul, the kind of sound that made every protective instinct Jerry had ever possessed stand up and take notice. "What in the Sam Hill?" he muttered, following the sound toward the row of rusted dumpsters behind the diner. The rain had turned the alley into a muddy mess, and Jerry's work boots squelched through puddles as he moved closer to the source of the crying. What he found made his heart nearly stop. Huddled against the back wheel of an overturned shopping cart, barely visible through the tangle of discarded cardboard and weeds, was a ball of matted fur no bigger than his fist. At first glance, Jerry thought it might be a house cat, some poor kitten abandoned by heartless owners. But as the tiny creature lifted its head and bared needle-sharp teeth at him, he saw the telltale tufts on its ears and the distinctive spots that marked it as something far wilder. It was a bobcat kitten, maybe 4 to 6 weeks old, and it was dying. The sight that greeted Jerry behind those dumpsters would haunt him for the rest of his days. The kitten's mother lay sprawled in the mud, her beautiful tawny coat matted with blood and rain. A bullet hole behind her left shoulder told the story. Poachers, most likely, taking a shot at what they probably thought was just another pest. The steel trap clamped around the kitten's left hind leg completed the picture of human cruelty that made Jerry's stomach turn. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Jerry whispered, dropping to his knees in the mud without caring about his clean pants. The kitten was trying to protect its mother's body, positioning itself between Jerry and the larger cat despite being barely strong enough to stand. Its left leg was mangled by the trap, and Jerry could see ribs showing through its fur like the keys of a broken piano. But it was the eyes that got to him. Those weren't the golden eyes typical of bobcats. These were an impossible shade of blue, like chips of winter sky. The kitten stared at Jerry with a mixture of terror and defiance that reminded him of every broken thing he'd ever tried to fix, every miner he'd pulled from a collapsed tunnel, every moment when giving up would have been easier than fighting. "Easy there, little one," Jerry murmured, his voice taking on the same gentle tone he'd used with Martha during her worst days in the hospital. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Just want to help." The kitten hissed again, a sound that would have been fierce if it hadn't been so pitiful coming from something so small. Jerry could see the fight leaving its tiny body with each labored breath. Without the trap, it might have had a chance to survive on its own for a few more days. With it, death was just a matter of hours. Jerry had spent 40 years making split-second decisions in mine shafts where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death. This moment felt exactly the same. He pulled the bolt cutters from his pickup truck and carefully, methodically, worked to free the kitten from the steel jaws that had been slowly crushing its leg. The little cat never stopped watching him, those impossible blue eyes tracking his every movement. When the trap finally released its grip, the kitten collapsed into Jerry's work-worn hands. It weighed nothing, maybe 8 or 9 ounces of bone and fury and sheer determination not to die. Jerry wrapped it in his flannel shirt, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against his palms. "You got fight in you like a ghost refusing to pass on," he told the kitten as he carefully placed it in a cardboard box lined with shop rags from his truck. "Guess I'll call you Spirit." The 45-minute drive to Dr. Sarah Crow Feather's veterinary clinic felt like the longest trip of Jerry's life. The kitten, Spirit, lay still in her makeshift bed, and more than once Jerry was certain she had died. But each time he checked, those blue eyes would crack open just enough to let him know she was still fighting. Dr. Crowfeather had been the only veterinarian within 50 miles who would treat anything that couldn't write a check. Half Lakota, half Irish, and 100% no-nonsense, she took one look at Jerry's bundle and shook her head. "Jerry Whitehawk, you know this is illegal as Sunday liquor sales," she said, carefully unwrapping the kitten on her examination table. "Federal crime to possess a wild bobcat. I should report this to Fish and Wildlife." "Then report it," Jerry replied, his jaw set in the stubborn line that Martha had always said could stop a charging bull. "But save her first." Dr. Crowfeather's expression softened as she examined the kitten's injuries. The leg was badly damaged, but not beyond repair. Severe malnutrition and dehydration were the more immediate threats. As she worked, preparing IV fluids and antibiotics, she glanced at Jerry with something that might have been respect. "My grandfather used to say that spirits come to teach us something," she said quietly. "Maybe this little one has a lesson for you." The X-rays revealed something that changed everything. Dr. Crowfeather held up the films against the light box and pointed to a shadowy area in the kitten's abdomen. "Jerry, this changes the whole situation. She's not just a kitten, she's a pregnant kitten. Stress-induced early maturity, probably. You're not just responsible for one life here, you're looking at maybe 3 or 4 more in about 6 weeks. Jerry stared at the X-ray images, his mind reeling. One dying kitten was manageable, if illegal. A whole family of bobcats was something else entirely. The financial burden alone would break him, and the legal consequences could land him in federal prison. But as he looked down at Spirit, now resting peacefully under warming blankets with IV fluids flowing into her tiny paw, Jerry felt something he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. Purpose. This small, broken thing needed him, and for the first time in 3 years, Jerry Whitehawk felt truly needed in return. "Well, I'll be hornswoggled," he whispered, using one of Martha's favorite expressions. "Guess I'm going to be a grandfather after all." 6 months had passed since Jerry carried a dying bobcat kitten out of that muddy alley, and the transformation in both their lives had been nothing short of miraculous. Spirit's mangled leg had healed with only a slight limp that gave her walk a distinctive swagger, like she was strutting through life with attitude to spare. She'd grown from a handful of bones and fur into 22 pounds of sleek muscle and intelligence that never ceased to amaze Jerry. The basement of Jerry's cabin had been converted into something that looked like a cross between a wildlife sanctuary and the world's most elaborate cat playground. Jerry had spent his meager savings on climbing trees, den boxes, and scratch posts, creating an environment where Spirit could exercise her natural instincts while staying safe from the harsh mountain weather. But it was Spirit's uncanny intelligence that truly set her apart from any animal Jerry had ever encountered. She had learned to turn door handles within her first month, much to Jerry's initial frustration when he'd find her wandering the house at 3 in the morning. She could operate the bathroom faucet to get fresh water, and Jerry swore she understood every word he said to her. When he'd sit on the porch in the evenings, talking to Martha's memory, Spirit would settle beside him with an attentiveness that made Jerry feel less alone than he had in years. The first snow of October brought with it the event Jerry had been both anticipating and dreading. He woke to Spirit's distressed calls from the basement and found her in the throes of labor in the den box he'd constructed from Martha's old quilts. For a man who'd spent his life working in mines where danger lurked around every corner, Jerry had never felt more helpless than watching Spirit struggle through her first delivery. "Come on, honey," he whispered, kneeling beside the den box with towels and warm water. "You got this." Nature's been handling this particular job long before we humans came along to mess things up. 3 hours later, Jerry found himself the unlikely midwife to 3 tiny bobcat kittens, each no bigger than a hamster and completely helpless. The first, was a dark gray male Jerry immediately dubbed Storm for the weather raging outside. The second, a reddish-brown female with Spirit's distinctive facial markings, became Ember. The third, a pale male with white markings that made him almost ghostly in the dim basement light, earned the name Ghost. As Jerry watched Spirit clean her babies with the fierce devotion of new motherhood, he felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut since Martha's death. For the first time in 3 years, he was witnessing new life instead of mourning what was lost. These weren't just Bobcat kittens, they were his grandchildren, the family he'd never thought he'd have. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, wiping his eyes with the back of his work-roughened hand. "First time I ever felt like a grandpa." The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that gave Jerry's days structure and purpose. He'd wake before dawn to check on the growing family, brew his coffee, and update a detailed journal about each kitten's development. Storm proved to be the adventurer, constantly trying to climb out of the den box before his legs were strong enough to support him. Ember was the thinker, watching everything with an intensity that reminded Jerry of her mother. Ghost, the smallest, was also the most affectionate, seeking out Jerry's hand whenever he reached into the den. But their peaceful existence was shattered on a cold November morning when Game Warden Jake Morrison appeared at Jerry's door with a citation book in his hand and a grim expression on his weather-beaten face. "Morning, Jerry," Morrison said, his tone carrying the weight of an unpleasant duty. "I've had a report about you keeping illegal wildlife on this property. You want to tell me what's going on here?" Jerry had known this moment would come eventually. Someone in town had noticed his frequent trips to Dr. Crowfeather's clinic or seen him buying large quantities of raw meat at the grocery store. In a small community like Millfield, secrets had a way of growing legs and walking right up to your front door. "I suppose you better come in and see for yourself," Jerry said, stepping aside to let the warden enter. There was no point in lying or making excuses. The evidence was literally living in his basement. Morrison's expression softened when he saw Spirit and her 3 kittens in their makeshift den. Even a man trained in wildlife law couldn't help but be moved by the sight of the Bobcat family that had clearly been well cared for and loved. "Jesus, Jerry," Morrison said quietly, "you know what this means, don't you? Federal crime to possess wild bobcats? I'm talking 50,000 in fines and possible jail time. You're looking at serious trouble here." Jerry squared his shoulders and looked Morrison straight in the eye. "You can fine me, arrest me, throw me in jail, but I ain't abandoning these babies. They needed help, and I was the only one around to give it. I'd do it again tomorrow if I had to." Before Morrison could respond, Dr. Crowfeather appeared at the basement door carrying a folder thick with official-looking documents. Jerry had called her the moment he saw the game warden's truck in his driveway, and she'd dropped everything to drive out to the cabin. "Jake Morrison, you old dog," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good thing I brought the rehabilitation permit paperwork. Jeremiah here has been operating under my supervision as an unofficial wildlife rehabber. Everything's been documented and above board." Morrison looked skeptical as he examined the hastily prepared documents, but Dr. Crowfeather's reputation in the community was unimpeachable. After 20 years of caring for everything from injured eagles to orphaned bears, her word carried considerable weight with wildlife officials. "This is highly irregular, Sarah," Morrison said finally. "But I suppose if you're willing to take responsibility for monitoring the situation—" "I am," she replied firmly. "Jerry's done remarkable work with these animals. They're healthy, properly socialized, and when the time comes, they'll be released back into the wild where they belong." As Morrison drove away with a warning instead of an arrest warrant, Jerry felt a mixture of relief and gratitude that left him momentarily speechless. Dr. Crowfeather had saved not just his freedom, but his newfound family as well. That afternoon brought another unexpected visitor, though this one was far less welcome. Victoria Sterling arrived at Jerry's door in a black SUV that looked out of place among the rusted pickup trucks and aging sedans that usually traveled these mountain roads. She was a handsome woman in her 50s, dressed in a business suit that probably cost more than Jerry's monthly Social Security check. "Mr. Whitehawk," she said, extending a manicured hand that Jerry chose not to shake. "I represent Sterling Development Corporation. I have a proposition that might interest you." Her offer was straightforward: $75,000 for his 40 acres and cabin, with a 30-day deadline for his answer. Jerry knew his property was worth at least twice that amount, but Victoria Sterling seemed confident that financial pressure would eventually force his hand. "This land ain't for sale," Jerry told her firmly. "Not to you, not to anybody, not for any amount of money." Victoria's smile never wavered, but Jerry caught something cold and calculating in her eyes that reminded him of the corporate executives who'd destroyed the coal industry while lining their own pockets. "Property taxes in this county are increasing substantially, Mr. Whitehawk. I'd hate to see you lose everything to the tax assessor when you could walk away with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your days." As she prepared to leave, Victoria paused on the porch and glanced toward the basement window where Spirit could be seen resting with her kittens. For just a moment, her composed facade cracked, and Jerry saw something that looked almost like recognition flash across her face. That's a beautiful cat you have there," she said, her voice slightly strained. "She is that," Jerry agreed, watching Victoria's reaction carefully. There was something in her expression that suggested she'd seen a bobcat before, under circumstances that had left a lasting impression. After Victoria's SUV disappeared down the mountain road, Jerry sat on his porch with Spirit at his feet and her 3 kittens tumbling around in the leaves. For the first time since Martha's death, he had something worth fighting for, something that made the future seem brighter than the past. Whatever Victoria Sterling had planned, Jerry was determined to protect his unlikely family at any cost. The next 6 years transformed Jerry's life in ways he never could have imagined when he first carried Spirit out of that muddy alley. What began as the rescue of a single dying kitten had evolved into something that resembled a wildlife preserve more than a simple mountain homestead. Spirit and her offspring had established a territory that encompassed Jerry's 40 acres and beyond, creating a thriving bobcat community that defied everything experts thought they knew about these solitary creatures. By the end of their first year together, Spirit had begun what Dr. Crow Feather called a soft release program entirely of her own design. She would disappear for days at a time, teaching Storm, Ember, and Ghost the skills they needed to survive in the wild, but always returning to Jerry's cabin as if it were home base. Jerry built a large outdoor enclosure connected to the house through a cat door he'd modified to accommodate much larger animals, giving the bobcats the freedom to come and go as they pleased. Storm was the first to establish his own territory, claiming the rocky outcropping 2 miles north of the cabin where he could hunt the rabbits and squirrels that thrived in the dense underbrush. Ember chose the creek bottom on the south side of the property, where her reddish coat blended perfectly with the autumn leaves that seemed to carpet the ground year-round. But Ghost, the pale male who'd been the smallest of the litter, never strayed far from Jerry's side, becoming his constant companion on daily walks through the forest. "You're more dog than wildcat," Jerry would tell Ghost, who had developed the unnerving habit of appearing at Jerry's elbow whenever he ventured into the woods, as silent as his namesake but twice as protective. The bond between them was something that made Doc Crowfeather shake her head in amazement during her monthly visits to check on the growing bobcat population. It was during Spirit's 2nd year that Jerry began to understand the true intelligence of these creatures. She started bringing potential mates to the cabin, introducing them to Jerry as if seeking his approval before allowing them to join her territory. The first was a massive male Jerry dubbed Thunder for the rumbling purr that vibrated through the walls whenever he was around. The second, a sleek female with one ear torn from some long-ago fight, became lightning for the speed with which she could disappear into the undergrowth. "It's like she's introducing boyfriends to her daddy," Jerry told Dr. Crow Feather during one of their regular checkups. "Never seen anything like it in all my years around wild animals." Dr. Crow Feather had been documenting Jerry's unique relationship with the bobcats for her own research, and what she was discovering challenged conventional wisdom about wildlife behavior. "These cats have created a social structure that's more complex than anything we've seen in bobcat populations," she explained. "Spirit has essentially made you the patriarch of an extended family group. It's unprecedented." By year 3, Jerry's property was home to 12 bobcats ranging from newborn kittens to full-grown adults, each with their own personality and role in what had become a genuine community. Jerry knew every animal by sight, had named them all, and kept detailed records of their health, behavior, and family relationships in a series of notebooks that were becoming quite thick. But the idyllic existence Jerry had built was under constant threat from Victoria Sterling's relentless pressure campaign. Each year brought new challenges designed to force him from his land. Property taxes that had been $1,200 annually when Martha was alive had risen to $8,000, an increase that Jerry could only afford by selling off Martha's jewelry, furniture, and everything else of value he'd accumulated over 40 years of marriage. The harassment went beyond financial pressure. Mysterious accidents began occurring with increasing frequency. Fence posts would be damaged overnight, forcing Jerry to spend money he didn't have on repairs. His water line developed leaks that seemed to happen every few months, each requiring a costly visit from a plumber. Building inspectors appeared at his door with citations for violations that had never existed before, demanding expensive upgrades to electrical and plumbing systems that had worked fine for decades. Jerry's neighbors, most of them elderly like himself, began selling their properties to Sterling Development one by one. The pressure was simply too much for people living on fixed incomes to withstand. Soon, Jerry found himself increasingly isolated as familiar faces disappeared and "for sale" signs sprouted like weeds along the mountain roads he'd traveled his entire life. The financial strain was taking its toll on Jerry's health as well. His heart medication, essential for managing the condition that had ended his mining career, cost $300 a month that he often couldn't afford. Some months he would ration the pills, taking them every other day or skipping doses entirely when the choice came down to medication or property taxes. The bobcats seemed to sense his declining health, staying closer to the cabin and showing increased protective behavior whenever strangers appeared. It was during year 4 that Jerry made a discovery that changed his understanding of Victoria Sterling's true motivations. While researching property records at the county courthouse, trying to understand the legal basis for his skyrocketing tax assessments, Jerry stumbled across a name that sent chills down his spine. David Blackstone, deceased, age 28, survived by wife Victoria. The memories came flooding back like water through a burst dam. 20 years ago, Jerry had been the shift supervisor when the mine shaft collapsed, trapping 5 miners, including young David Blackstone. Jerry had stayed after his shift ended, digging through rubble with his bare hands until they were raw and bloody, trying desperately to reach the trapped men. They'd saved 4, but David had been too far back in the tunnel, crushed by falling timbers before rescue crews could reach him. Jerry remembered David's pregnant wife at the funeral, a young woman wild with grief who'd screamed accusations at Jerry in front of the entire congregation. "You left my husband to die," she had cried. "You could have saved him, but you didn't try hard enough." Jerry had carried that guilt for 2 decades, wondering if he could have done more, moved faster, tried harder to save David Blackstone's life. Victoria Blackstone had become Victoria Sterling, and Jerry was now certain that her development company's interest in his property was about revenge, not business. She wanted to destroy the place where he'd found peace, to take away the only happiness he'd known since Martha's death. The realization filled Jerry with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Perhaps he deserved this punishment for failing to save her husband all those years ago. As Jerry's financial situation grew more desperate, his relationship with the Bobcat community deepened. Spirit had given birth to 2 more litters over the years, and Jerry had become grandfather to 15 bobcats, spanning 3 generations. Each animal had its own personality and place in the complex social structure that had evolved around Jerry's cabin. Some were shy and rarely showed themselves, while others, like Ghost, seemed to consider Jerry part of their family. The tourists started coming in year 5, drawn by word-of-mouth stories about the mountain man who talks to wildcats. Jerry found their presence both amusing and slightly annoying. But the small fees he charged for guided tours of his property helped offset some of the crushing financial pressure from Victoria Sterling's campaign. People would drive hours through winding mountain roads to see Jerry interact with his bobcat family, taking photos and videos that found their way onto social media, spreading his story even further. "You're famous, Jerry," Dr. Crowfeather told him during one of her visits. "There are wildlife biologists from 3 universities who want to study what you've accomplished here. What you've done challenges everything we thought we knew about bobcat behavior and human-wildlife relationships." But fame couldn't pay Jerry's mounting debts or improve his deteriorating health. By year 6, he'd lost 30 pounds and developed a persistent cough that worried Dr. Crowfeather. His hands shook when he tried to write in his daily journals, and he'd begun having episodes where his heart would race for no apparent reason. The bobcats sensed his declining condition and responded by becoming even more protective, rarely leaving him alone and showing increasing agitation when strangers approached the property. Jerry's neighbors had all but disappeared, their properties sold to Sterling Development, and left vacant while environmental impact studies and zoning applications worked their way through county bureaucracy. Jerry was now essentially alone on the mountain except for his bobcat family, surrounded by empty houses and no trespassing signs that marked the expanding boundaries of Victoria Sterling's empire. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Victoria's campaign. Jerry had grown up in a community where neighbors looked out for each other, where folks dropped by unannounced just to check on elderly residents and make sure they had everything they needed. Now his closest human neighbors were 15 miles away, and some days the only voices he heard were his own and the memories of Martha that seemed to grow stronger as his physical condition weakened. But through it all, the bobcats remained constant. Spirit, now 8 years old and the undisputed matriarch of the mountain's bobcat population, continued to treat Jerry as family. Her children and grandchildren showed him the same acceptance and affection, creating a support network that was unlike anything documented in wildlife literature. When Jerry was ill, they stayed close to the cabin. When his spirits were low, Ghost would appear at his side as if summoned by some invisible signal. Jerry began to understand that what he'd created here was more than just a wildlife sanctuary. It was a demonstration of something that most people thought impossible: genuine friendship between humans and wild animals. The bobcats weren't pets or trained performers. They were wild creatures who had chosen to include one lonely old man in their family structure. It was a testament to the power of patience, respect, and unconditional love that transcended species boundaries. As year 7 began, Jerry knew his time was running out. His savings were exhausted, his health was failing, and Victoria Sterling's legal noose was tightening around his neck. But as he sat on his porch each evening, surrounded by bobcats who had learned to trust him completely, Jerry felt a sense of accomplishment that no amount of financial pressure could diminish. He had created something beautiful and unprecedented, a living proof that love and kindness could overcome even the deepest differences between species. The final notice arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt heavy with the kind of dread Jerry hadn't experienced since the day Martha stopped breathing. Victoria Sterling's lawyer had delivered the ultimatum in language that was both crystal clear and utterly devastating. $45,000 in back taxes and penalties due within 30 days, or face immediate foreclosure proceedings that would strip Jerry of everything he'd ever owned. Jerry spread the legal documents across Martha's old kitchen table, his weathered hands trembling as he tried to make sense of numbers that might as well have been written in a foreign language. His checking account held $3,200, the sum total of his life savings after selling everything of value Martha had left behind. The local bank had already refused his loan application, citing insufficient collateral and questionable ability to repay. At 68, with a failing heart and no steady income beyond Social Security, Jerry Whitehawk was nobody's idea of a good investment. "Guess it's time to say goodbye, old girl," he whispered to Martha's photograph, his voice cracking with the weight of defeat he'd managed to avoid for so many years. The bobcats seemed to sense his despair, gathering closer to the cabin than usual, their amber eyes watching him with an intensity that suggested they understood more than any wild animal should. Dr. Crow Feather had tried her best to help, organizing a fundraising campaign she'd optimistically titled Save Jerry's Sanctuary. The local newspaper ran a feature story about the mountain man who'd created an unprecedented wildlife preserve through nothing but love and patience. Social media posts about Jerry and his bobcat family garnered thousands of shares and heartfelt comments from animal lovers across the country. But sympathy didn't translate into substantial donations, and after 3 weeks of tireless effort, Dr. Crowfeather had managed to raise only $12,000, not nearly enough to satisfy Victoria Sterling's demands. "I appreciate everything you've done, Sarah," Jerry told her when she brought him the disappointing news. "But I can't take charity from folks who probably need that money more than I do. I've made it this far on my own, and I'll figure out how to handle this mess the same way." It was Martha's voice that seemed to echo in his memory during those dark moments. "Pride goeth before the fall, Jerry Whitehawk. Sometimes accepting help ain't charity. It's just good sense." But Jerry's mountain pride ran deeper than good sense, carved into his character by generations of ancestors who'd preferred to starve rather than ask for handouts. The strange behavior among Jerry's bobcat family began during the final week before Victoria's deadline. Instead of their usual scattered hunting patterns across the mountain, all 15 cats began congregating around Jerry's cabin in a way that defied everything Dr. Crowfeather knew about bobcat territorial behavior. Spirit, now the undisputed matriarch of the mountain's bobcat population, led her extended family in what could only be described as a protective formation around Jerry's property. Ghost, Jerry's constant companion, refused to leave his side even for hunting expeditions, positioning himself at Jerry's feet whenever the old man sat on the porch. Storm and Ember, now fully grown adults with their own territories, abandoned their usual haunts to take up residence in the trees surrounding the cabin. Even the newest litters, kittens who should have been focused on learning basic survival skills, seemed more interested in maintaining their vigil around Jerry's home. "I ain't never seen anything like this in 30 years of wildlife study, Doctor," Crowfeather admitted during her final visit before the foreclosure deadline. "It's like they know something's wrong and they're trying to protect you from it. But Jerry, you can't expect them to understand human legal problems. These cats can't pay your taxes or stop a sheriff's sale." Jerry nodded, understanding the futility of his situation while still finding comfort in his Bobcat family's loyalty. "Maybe they can't fix my problems," he said, scratching behind Ghost's ears as the pale bobcat pressed against his legs. "But they're the only family I got left, and family sticks together, even when things look hopeless." Victoria Sterling arrived for the final confrontation on a crisp autumn morning that painted the mountain in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Jerry of better times. She came with Sheriff Tom Bradley and a legal aide carrying an official-looking briefcase, clearly prepared to execute the foreclosure with maximum efficiency and minimum sentiment. What none of them expected was the reception committee that awaited them in Jerry's front yard. 12 adult bobcats and 3 juveniles had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the cabin's front porch, their eyes fixed on the approaching vehicles with the kind of focused attention that made Sheriff Bradley stop his patrol car 50 yards from the house. Jerry emerged from the cabin looking frailer than Victoria remembered, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost too much weight, his face bearing the gray pallor of a man whose heart was working too hard to keep him alive. "Jesus Christ, Jerry," Sheriff Bradley said, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon as he surveyed the assembled bobcats. "I can't serve papers with all those wildcats around." "You need to get them away from here before somebody gets hurt." "They ain't gonna hurt nobody unless somebody tries to hurt me first," Jerry replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd spent decades managing dangerous situations in coal mines. "But I can't make them leave, Tom. This is their home too, and they got just as much right to be here as anybody else." Victoria Sterling stepped out of her luxury SUV with the kind of carefully controlled composure that Jerry recognized from corporate executives who'd destroyed his mining career without losing a minute's sleep. But as her eyes took in the sight of Jerry surrounded by his bobcat family, something flickered across her face that looked almost like shock, or perhaps recognition of something she hadn't expected to see. "Mr. Whitehawk," she said, her voice slightly strained as she addressed him from a safe distance. "I'm here to finalize the foreclosure proceedings. You've had 30 days to arrange payment, and according to my records, the full amount remains outstanding." Jerry stepped down from his porch, moving slowly but with dignity intact, Ghost at his side like a four-legged bodyguard. "I know what you're here for, Victoria, and I know why you're really doing this. But before you take everything I got left, I want you to know that I remember David. I remember trying to save him, and I remember failing. If this makes you feel better about losing him, then I guess that's something." The mention of her dead husband's name hit Victoria like a physical blow, cracking the professional facade she'd maintained for 20 years of planning this moment. Her carefully controlled expression crumbled, revealing raw pain that time hadn't healed, anger that had festered into something that consumed her entire life's purpose. "You don't get to say his name," she whispered, tears she'd thought were long exhausted beginning to flow down her cheeks. "You don't get to pretend you cared about him when you left him to die in that mine." Jerry's own composure began to fracture as memories of that terrible day came flooding back. The sound of the cave-in, the desperate digging through rubble with bleeding hands, the moment when he'd realized they weren't going to reach David Blackstone in time. "I stayed after my shift ended," he said, his voice breaking. "I dug until my hands were raw and bloody. I did everything I could to save him, Victoria. Everything." Spirit, sensing the emotional intensity of the confrontation, rose from her position and moved to stand beside Jerry, her blue eyes fixed on Victoria with an expression that seemed almost protective. The other bobcats shifted restlessly, responding to their matriarch's alert posture and the obvious distress of the human they'd accepted as family. Sheriff Bradley, uncomfortable with the emotional drama unfolding in front of him, and increasingly nervous about the growing agitation among the bobcats, tried to restore some semblance of official procedure to the situation. Jerry, I'm going to need you to secure these animals so we can complete the legal process. I can't have wildcats interfering with official county business. But before Jerry could respond, the stress of the confrontation, combined with months of rationed heart medication and the crushing weight of losing everything he'd ever loved, triggered the massive cardiac event that Dr. Crow Feather had been warning him about for years. Jerry clutched his chest, his face contorting with pain as he collapsed to his knees in the fallen leaves that carpeted his front yard. Spirit immediately moved to Jerry's side, pressing her warm body against him, as Ghost began making distressed calls that brought the other bobcats running. Victoria Sterling, confronted with the sight of her nemesis potentially dying in front of her, found herself faced with a choice that would define the rest of her life. Let the man she blamed for her husband's death suffer alone, or set aside 20 years of anger to help save the person who had shown more love to wild animals than she had managed to show to another human being in decades. "Call 911!" she shouted to her legal aide, dropping to her knees beside Jerry without regard for her expensive clothes or the wild animals that surrounded them. "Now! Call them right now!" The ambulance ride down the winding mountain road felt like a journey through purgatory, with Jerry drifting in and out of consciousness while paramedics worked frantically to stabilize his failing heart. Through the morphine haze, he could hear radio chatter about his condition. Words like massive myocardial infarction and critical that painted a picture grim enough to penetrate even his drug-addled awareness. What struck him most was the voice he heard giving information to the emergency room, Victoria Sterling, riding in the ambulance she'd insisted on accompanying, providing medical history and insurance details with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. At Millfield General Hospital, Dr. Patricia Hayes delivered the diagnosis that everyone had been dreading, but nobody wanted to hear spoken aloud. Jerry had suffered a major heart attack, his fourth in the past 2 years, according to the scarring visible on the EKG. The damage to his cardiac muscle was extensive, and his prognosis without immediate surgical intervention was measured in weeks, not months. He needs a triple bypass plus valve replacement, Dr. Hayes explained to Victoria, who had somehow become Jerry's de facto next of kin in the absence of any other family members. The surgery alone will cost $85,000, and that's before we factor in ICU recovery, medications, and rehabilitation. Does he have insurance coverage? Victoria looked through the Medicare paperwork that covered basic hospitalization, but left Jerry facing catastrophic out-of-pocket expenses that would bankrupt him even if he survived the surgery. The bitter irony wasn't lost on her. She was about to foreclose on Jerry's property for $45,000, while he needed twice that amount to save his life. "What happens if he can't afford the surgery?" Victoria asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Doctor." Hayes's expression told the whole story before she spoke. "We'll keep him comfortable and manage his pain, but without intervention his heart will continue to deteriorate. He's looking at congestive heart failure, probably within the month." The vigil that developed outside Jerry's hospital room defied every regulation Millfield General had ever attempted to enforce regarding visiting hours and appropriate behavior. Spirit had led the entire Bobcat family to the hospital grounds, where they established a protective perimeter around the building that sent staff members scurrying for safety and brought local news crews running for what they sensed would be an unprecedented story. 15 bobcats arranging themselves in a circle around a hospital building wasn't something that appeared in any wildlife management textbook, but there they were, maintaining their posts through the night while Jerry fought for his life 3 stories above them. Spirit positioned herself directly beneath Jerry's room, her blue eyes fixed on the window where she somehow knew her human family member was struggling to survive. "Never seen anything like this in 30 years of emergency medicine," Dr. Hayes told the gathering crowd of nurses, orderlies, and administrators who had come to witness the spectacle. Those cats have been out there for 12 hours straight, and they haven't moved except to drink from the creek behind the parking lot. It's like they're holding some kind of vigil. The media attention that followed turned Jerry's story into a national phenomenon that would have amazed and probably embarrassed the dying man if he'd been conscious to witness it. Cable news networks picked up the story of the mountain man whose Bobcat family was keeping vigil while he lay dying from a heart condition he couldn't afford to treat. Social media exploded with images and videos of the cats maintaining their protective circle, turning Jerry Whitehawk into an unlikely symbol of the bond between humans and wildlife. Victoria found herself spending 18 hours a day at the hospital, sitting beside Jerry's bed while he drifted in and out of consciousness. During his lucid moments, Jerry would ask about the cats, and Victoria would tell him about their vigil outside, watching his face transform with a mixture of wonder and heartbreak as he realized his Bobcat family was suffering along with him. "They shouldn't be there," Jerry whispered during one of his clearer moments, his voice barely audible above the constant beeping of monitors that tracked his failing cardiovascular system. "Wild animals don't belong in parking lots and around all those people. They need to be back in the mountains where they're safe." Victoria had been preparing for this conversation, knowing that Jerry's concern for his cats would eventually override his own survival instincts. "They're not leaving, Jerry. Dr. Crowfeather has been out there trying to coax them back to your property, but they won't budge. It's like they know something we don't." What Jerry didn't know, because Victoria hadn't found the courage to tell him, was that his story had generated over $200,000 in donations from people around the world who had been moved by the images of wild animals refusing to abandon their human friend. The money was more than enough to pay for his surgery and cover his property taxes. But Jerry's condition had deteriorated to the point where Dr. Hayes wasn't certain he was strong enough to survive the operating table. Thomas Whitehawk arrived on a red-eye flight from Denver after seeing his biological father's story on the national news. At 45, he bore enough resemblance to Jerry that hospital staff immediately recognized the family connection, though the emotional distance between father and son was obvious to anyone who witnessed their awkward reunion in the ICU. "I saw the news," Thomas said, standing at the foot of Jerry's bed with the uncomfortable posture of a man who wasn't sure he belonged there. "Thought maybe... well, I thought I should come." Jerry's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the son he'd given away 45 years earlier, seeing Martha's delicate bone structure combined with his own stubborn jawline in a face that was both familiar and foreign. "I always wondered what kind of man you turned out to be," Jerry whispered. "Looks like you turned out fine without me." Thomas pulled a chair closer to the bed, his own emotions finally breaking through the professional reserve he'd maintained throughout his successful career as an environmental lawyer. "I hired a private detective when I turned 30. Found out about you and Martha, about the mine accident, about Mom dying so young. I was angry for a long time, thinking you just abandoned me because you didn't want to be bothered with a baby." Victoria listened to their conversation from her chair by the window, understanding for the first time the full scope of loss that had shaped Jerry's life. He'd lost his wife, given up his son, survived a mining career that had destroyed his health, and now faced losing the only family he had left, a collection of wild animals who had chosen to love him despite every instinct that should have kept them away from humans. Dr. Hayes returned that evening with test results that painted an even grimmer picture of Jerry's condition. His heart function had declined further overnight, and the window for surgical intervention was closing rapidly. "We need to make a decision about treatment," she told Thomas and Victoria. "He's not strong enough for major surgery, but there might be some less invasive options that could buy him some time." Jerry, who had been listening despite appearing to be asleep, opened his eyes and fixed Dr. Hayes with a look that carried 4 decades of hard-won wisdom. "How much time are we talking about?" And what kind of life would I have afterward? Dr. Hayes's honesty was both brutal and compassionate. Maybe 3 to 6 months, with significant limitations. You'd be looking at oxygen assistance, restricted mobility, constant medical supervision. It wouldn't be the life you're used to living, Jerry. Jerry closed his eyes and was quiet for so long that Victoria thought he might have lost consciousness again. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had made peace with his mortality. I want to go home. I want to die in my own bed with my cats around me, looking out at the mountains Martha and I loved. That's worth more to me than 6 months hooked up to machines in a hospital room. The silence that followed Jerry's decision was broken by the sound of Victoria Sterling weeping for the second time in 20 years, mourning not just the man she'd spent 2 decades trying to destroy, but the realization that her quest for revenge had blinded her to the simple humanity that had motivated every decision Jerry Whitehawk had ever made. 48 hours after Jerry made his decision to go home and die with dignity, Victoria Sterling sat alone in her hotel room staring at a manila folder that had the power to change everything she thought she knew about the past 20 years of her life. The folder contained David Blackstone's personnel file from the mining company, documents she'd finally found the courage to request after watching Jerry nearly die in front of her. What she discovered inside shattered the foundation of hatred upon which she'd built her entire adult life. According to the official reports, David had volunteered for the dangerous assignment that killed him, overriding Jerry's explicit recommendation against sending anyone into the unstable section of the mine. The safety inspector's report, buried in bureaucratic language but clear in its implications, stated that Jerry Whitehawk had argued against the work order for 3 hours before being overruled by corporate management who were under pressure to meet production quotas. Jerry hadn't abandoned David. He had tried desperately to prevent the assignment that killed him. Victoria's hands shook as she read testimony from other miners who described Jerry staying after his shift ended, digging through rubble with bleeding fingers until rescue crews had to physically remove him from the collapse site. The man she'd blamed for David's death had actually risked his own life trying to save her husband, and she'd spent 20 years punishing him for a failure that had never been his fault. The cruelest revelation came in the form of a letter David had written to Victoria 2 weeks before his death, a letter that had been returned to the mining company's office when Victoria moved after the funeral and was never forwarded to her new address. In David's careful handwriting, she read words that felt like daggers in her heart. If something happens to me in the mine, don't blame Jerry Whitehawk. He's the only supervisor down here who actually cares about keeping us safe. Take care of our baby, and don't let my death make you bitter. I want you to be happy, Victoria. That's all I ever wanted. Victoria had lost their baby 2 months after David's funeral, a miscarriage brought on by the stress and grief that consumed her during those terrible weeks. She'd never told anyone about the pregnancy except David, and losing both her husband and their unborn child had left her with a rage that demanded a target. Jerry Whitehawk had been convenient, and she'd focused every ounce of her pain and fury on destroying the man who had actually tried to save the only person she'd ever truly loved. When Victoria arrived at the hospital the next morning, she found Jerry awake and alert for the first time in days, sitting up in bed and talking quietly with Thomas about the environmental law practice that had made his son successful. The physical resemblance between father and son was striking now that they were together, but Victoria could see something deeper, a shared gentleness that manifested in their concern for things that couldn't protect themselves. "Thomas tells me you're a tree hugger like your old man," Jerry was saying, his voice weak but carrying traces of the humor that had sustained him through decades of hardship. "Says you've been fighting the good fight against corporations that want to strip mine everything between here and Kentucky." Thomas smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness Victoria had seen from him since he'd arrived. Guess I inherited your need to protect things that can't protect themselves. Took me 45 years to understand where that came from. Victoria approached Jerry's bed, carrying the manila folder and the letter David had written 20 years earlier, her heart pounding with the knowledge that she was about to confess to a level of cruelty that would shame her for the rest of her days. Jerry noticed her distress immediately, his eyes focusing on her face with the kind of concern that made her understand why wild animals had learned to trust him. "You look like hell, Victoria," he said gently. "When's the last time you got any real sleep?" Victoria couldn't find words to answer his question, so instead she placed David's letter in Jerry's hands and watched his face as he read her dead husband's final message to her. The silence in the hospital room was broken only by the constant beeping of monitors and the distant sound of nurses making their rounds. But Victoria felt as though the entire world had stopped turning while Jerry absorbed the truth about David's death. "Sweet Jesus," Jerry whispered when he finished reading, his eyes filling with tears as he looked at Victoria with an expression of profound sadness. "You never got this letter. You spent 20 years thinking I killed your husband, and you never knew he wrote this." Victoria nodded, unable to speak as 20 years of misdirected hatred crashed down around her like the mine shaft that had taken David's life. "I found his personnel file," she finally managed to say. "I know you tried to stop them from sending him into that section. I know you stayed and dug until they dragged you away. I know. I know you're not the monster I made you out to be." Jerry reached for Victoria's hand with fingers that felt as fragile as bird bones, his touch gentle despite everything she'd put him through. "I couldn't save him, Victoria. I tried, but I couldn't save him. That's something I've had to live with every day for 20 years, wondering if I could have done something different, something better." Thomas, who had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding, spoke quietly from his chair beside the bed. "Is this why you've been trying to take his land? Because you thought he was responsible for your husband's death?" Victoria's confession came out in broken fragments, 20 years of pain and rage and carefully constructed justifications crumbling under the weight of truth. She told them about the foreclosure proceedings, about the systematic harassment designed to drive Jerry from his home, about the property tax manipulation that had pushed him to the edge of financial ruin. She told them about watching Jerry with his bobcats and slowly realizing that the man she'd painted as a villain was actually someone who showed more love and compassion to wild animals than she'd managed to show to another human being in decades. "I wanted to destroy you," she said, tears streaming down her face as she confessed to the most shameful period of her life. "I thought taking away your peace would somehow give me mine back. But watching you with those cats, seeing how much they love you, David would have done the same thing. He always said you were the best supervisor, that you actually cared about your men." Jerry squeezed Victoria's hand with what little strength he had left, his voice barely above a whisper, as he offered forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. "David was a good man who deserved a better ending than he got. And you deserved better than spending 20 years carrying around all that anger and pain. We both lost someone we loved that day, Victoria. Maybe it's time we stopped punishing ourselves for surviving when he didn't." Thomas had been making quiet phone calls during this emotional reunion, and he returned to Jerry's bedside with news that transformed their conversation from confession to action. "The donations that have been pouring in from your story have reached $300,000, he told Jerry. "People from around the world have been sending money to help with your medical bills and save your property." Jerry stared at his son in disbelief, struggling to comprehend the scope of generosity from strangers who had been moved by images of bobcats keeping vigil for a dying man. $300,000? From people who don't even know me? Victoria had been expecting this moment, and she reached into her briefcase to produce legal documents that represented the most important decision of her adult life. "I'm withdrawing the foreclosure proceedings," she said, placing the papers on Jerry's bedside table. "I'm also establishing a trust fund to cover your medical expenses and ensure that your property remains a wildlife preserve for as long as you live." The biggest revelation was yet to come. Victoria explained that Sterling Development had never intended to build a resort on Jerry's mountain. Her actual plan, developed over months of watching Jerry interact with his bobcat family, had been to create a wildlife preserve that would honor David's memory by protecting the kind of wild places he had loved. The foreclosure threat had been designed to force a quick sale to her company, preventing other developers from acquiring the land and genuinely destroying it. "You were protecting me while I thought you were destroying me?" Jerry asked, his voice filled with wonder at the complexity of Victoria's deception. Victoria nodded, ashamed of the elaborate ruse, but proud of its ultimate purpose. "I had to make it look real, or other companies would have interfered. But Jerry, I need you to know that every decision I made about this land was about preservation, not development. I just couldn't find the courage to tell you the truth until now." Dr. Crow Feather arrived that afternoon with news that the bobcat vigil outside had attracted the attention of wildlife biologists from 3 major universities, all of whom wanted to study the unprecedented relationship Jerry had developed with the mountain's bobcat population. The scientific community was calling Jerry's work with the cats groundbreaking and paradigm-shifting, terms that made the dying man chuckle despite his failing condition. As the sun set over the mountains that had been Jerry's home for 68 years, 3 broken people sat together in a hospital room and began the process of healing wounds that had festered for decades. Outside, 15 bobcats maintained their vigil, unaware that their human family member had just been given a second chance at life, love, and the kind of legacy that most people only dream about leaving behind. 3 months later, Jerry Whitehawk sat on his front porch watching the sunrise paint the Appalachian Mountains in shades of gold and amber that reminded him why Martha had fallen in love with this place 60 years earlier. The surgery had been successful beyond Dr. Hayes's most optimistic predictions, and Jerry's recovery had astonished everyone except the bobcats who had never doubted that their human family member would return home where he belonged. The Whitehawk Sterling Wildlife Preserve now encompassed 2,000 acres of protected bobcat habitat, funded by Victoria's Development Company and sustained by donations that continued to pour in from around the world. Jerry served as the preserve's head caretaker, drawing a modest salary that came with comprehensive medical benefits and the kind of job security he'd never experienced during his mining career. Victoria, who had moved into a small cabin on the preserve's eastern boundary, served as the facility's director and had discovered a talent for wildlife photography that helped document the remarkable social structure Jerry's bobcat family had developed. Thomas visited monthly with his wife and 2 children, bringing Jerry's biological grandchildren to meet the bobcats, who had become internet celebrities through a documentary series that National Geographic was producing. 8-year-old Emily and 6-year-old Michael Whitehawk showed the same gentle patience with wild animals that had made their grandfather famous, sitting quietly for hours while Spirit's latest litter played around their feet. "Grandpa Jerry," Emily said during their most recent visit, her young voice serious with the kind of profound questions that only children dare to ask, "Why did the bobcats stay with you when you were sick?" "My teacher says wild animals are supposed to be afraid of people." Jerry smiled as he watched Ghost approach Emily with the cautious dignity that had made him Jerry's constant companion for 8 years. "Well, sweetheart, I think maybe they stayed because they understood something that took me a long time to learn. Family ain't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who shows up when you need them most." The preserve had become a pilgrimage destination for wildlife enthusiasts and researchers studying the unprecedented relationship between Jerry and his extended bobcat family. Dr. Crow Feather had established a research station on the property, documenting behavior patterns that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about bobcat social structures. Spirit, now 11 years old and the undisputed matriarch of the mountain's bobcat population, had successfully raised 4 generations of kittens, who all treated Jerry as an accepted member of their community. Victoria's transformation had been as remarkable as Jerry's recovery. The anger that had consumed 20 years of her life had been replaced by a passion for wildlife conservation that honored David's memory in ways her quest for revenge never could have achieved. She'd established a foundation that funded similar projects across Appalachia, protecting habitat for endangered species while providing economic opportunities for rural communities that had been devastated by the decline of coal mining. "David would have loved this place," Victoria said as she joined Jerry on the porch for their weekly dinner together, a tradition that had developed during Jerry's recovery period. "He always said the mountains were where he felt closest to God. I think he'd be proud of what we've built here." Jerry nodded, understanding the peace that had finally settled over Victoria's features after decades of carrying grief that had shaped every decision she'd made. "Martha used to say that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are just God's way of pointing us toward something better. Took me a long time to understand what she meant, but sitting here with all this—" He gestured toward the meadow where 15 bobcats were scattered in peaceful coexistence. "I think maybe she was right." The evening ritual that had developed around dinner time at the preserve never failed to amaze visitors who witnessed it. As Victoria and Jerry prepared their meal, Spirit would lead her extended family in a gradual convergence on the cabin's front yard. They weren't begging for food or seeking human interaction. They were simply choosing to share the same space, creating a mixed species community that existed nowhere else in the scientific literature. Thomas had proven invaluable in handling the legal complexities of establishing the preserve while maintaining Jerry's desire to keep the operation as simple and natural as possible. His environmental law practice had relocated to West Virginia, allowing him to spend more time with the father he'd only recently gotten to know, and the Bobcat family that had taught him new lessons about the meaning of loyalty. "I spent 40 years wondering what kind of man my birth father was," Thomas told the documentary crew during their final interview. "Turns out, he was exactly the kind of man who would risk everything to save something small and helpless. I just wish it hadn't taken me so long to figure that out." As the sun began to set behind the mountains that had sheltered the Whitehawk family for 4 generations, Jerry reflected on the journey that had brought him from the depths of loneliness to a life surrounded by more family than he'd ever imagined possible. Spirit approached the porch with her characteristic dignified gait, the slight limp from her old injury giving her walk the swagger that had first made Jerry smile 8 years earlier. She settled beside his rocking chair and began the rumbling purr that had become Jerry's favorite sound in the world, a vibration that seemed to resonate through the wooden planks of the porch and into his chest where his surgically repaired heart beat with newfound strength. Ghost appeared at Jerry's other side, completing the triangle of trust that had sustained all of them through the darkest periods of their lives. "You know what I learned from all this?" Jerry said to Victoria as they watched the last light fade from the mountain peaks. "Sometimes the family you create is stronger than the family you were born into. And love, well, love don't recognize species boundaries. It just recognizes need and does whatever it takes to fill it." Victoria raised her coffee cup in a gentle toast to the man who had taught her that forgiveness was more powerful than revenge, and that the best way to honor the dead was to dedicate your life to protecting the living. "To second chances," she said quietly. "To second chances," Jerry agreed as 15 bobcats settled into their evening positions around the cabin and the mountains whispered their approval of a story that had finally found its proper ending. In the gathering darkness, 3 generations of humans and bobcats shared the same peaceful space, proof that love, patience, and forgiveness could indeed bridge any divide, even the one between species that were never supposed to be family. At 68, Jerry Whitehawk thought his story was over. Widowed, broke, and facing the loss of his mountain home, he felt invisible in a world that had moved on without him. But sometimes, life's greatest chapters begin when we think the book is closing. When Jerry rescued a dying bobcat kitten 8 years ago, he discovered something profound. Family isn't defined by blood or species. It's defined by who shows up when you need them most. That starving kitten grew into Spirit, a magnificent bobcat who returned with her own family to save Jerry's life when his heart failed. Through Jerry's journey from crushing loneliness to unexpected purpose, we see that our deepest connections often come from the most unlikely places. His story reminds us that even in our later years, when society may overlook our value, we still have immeasurable capacity to love, nurture, and create lasting legacies. The Whitehawk Sterling Wildlife Preserve now protects thousands of acres and 3 generations of bobcats, proving that one act of kindness can ripple through generations. Jerry found his greatest purpose not in his youth, but in his golden years, showing us all that it's never too late to discover why we're here. Questions for reflection. Have you ever found family in unexpected places or discovered new purpose later in life? What small act of kindness could you do today that might create lasting change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone who needs to hear it.